Hi, welcome again to Off the Page. I'm Leslie Choice. My guest today is Andy Wainwright. He has a novel called A Deathful Ridge about a climber of Mount Everest, and he also has edited a collection of letters by Margaret Laurence. The two things seem extremely different, but maybe we'll find a link there. Hi, Andy. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Leslie. Thank you.
Let's talk about the novel first. You've written about explorers before, particularly explorers who like to go to cold, dangerous places. What's the attraction?
Well, I think it probably goes back to my English ancestry and the fact that I had an uncle who was an explorer of kinds. He was a mountain climber. He went to Mount Everest in the 1960s, and he was interested in such things. And when I was a boy, he sent me lots of books about South Pole journeys and about trips to Mount Everest. So I first read about Mallory when I was maybe 9 or 10 years old. And then it goes underground and surfaces years later.
There's something very Canadian about wanting to write about cold places, I would think.
I guess so, though I think that the British obviously write about such things, and their weather isn't quite the same.
Yeah. With the novel here, A Deathful Ridge, tell me just briefly what elements are fact, and then where does the fiction kick in?
Well, it's a combination of the two, and really it's an exploration of the relationship between fact and fiction, and what Laurence called fiction more true than fact. I was very interested in the Mallory story, the official historical versions of, or version I should say, capital V, of Mallory, who he was and what he represented and how he died. And it seemed to me that really he was a combination of stories, because nobody knows actually what happened to him. And if you start with the death, the disappearance, which is only a death because nobody knows what happened, and start moving back, you begin to realize how many different stories go to make up the official version.
But isn't that a bit audacious to take somebody who was real and turn him into a fictionalized character?
Yeah, but everybody's a text, Leslie, that's the point. Mallory's a text. He exists today in our imaginations because people have written about him and because there are a few brief film clips of him. And then we read the texts and interpret them. And I'm rewriting some of those texts.
Okay, but what's your motivation for inserting your imagination into historical fact?
I'm interested in the way historical fact is constructed. There is no capital T truth, and there are no capital T facts. I mean, aside from ones that say George Mallory went to Mount Everest 3 times, 1921, 1922, 1924, and he disappeared there in 1924 on the upper slopes of the mountain. Those are facts. What people do with those facts is really where the stories begin. And those stories generate the great numbers of texts that we have and subsequently read.
I get the feeling then that you probably don't even trust the kind of history that's laid down in history books.
Well, history books are versions of the past. And usually they're official versions of the past that serve specific political and social purposes. So I'm in my teaching at the undergraduate and graduate level, I'm constantly asking my students to call such things into question. So if I'm going to write a fiction, it follows from that.
Okay. From what you know of historical fact, tell me what kind of a person was George Mallory?
Well, we know that he was a revered figure. His nickname was Galahad. He really represented old Victorian, pre-World War I Victorian and Edwardian values of courage and honor and beauty. He was a very physically handsome man and physical ability, athleticism. He was also an intellectual. He was a friend of Virginia Woolf, of Rupert Brooke, of Robert Graves, of people of that ilk, and he moved in the Bloomsbury Circle. So I was interested in him because of that combination of the mind and the body.
Sounds like a fairly elite kind of character. Tell me a bit more about that world that he came from.
Well, the world that he came from, as I said, was a pre-World War I world before so much was blown away. And it was a world in which individuals who in the British context, in the British Empire context, individuals who had ability and who had a certain amount of financial support, well, there was no limit for them. They could go where they wanted to go and do what they wanted to do. And Mallory was one of those people who pushed things to the limit in that respect. He was a school teacher. First of all, taught at a boys' private school. Then had just begun to be associated with Cambridge University, where he had been educated in the outreach program, education program. I guess the university programs taken to different areas of Britain. He was about to become the director of that when he died.
So what sends that kind of a man all the way to Everest? Certainly if he wanted to be a mountain climber, there were a lot more nearby mountains that were less challenging.
Well, he had exhausted what was nearby. He went to the top of Mount Blanc, the highest mountain in Europe, when he was 18 years old. He climbed extensively in North Wales, in Snowdonia, when he was a youth and a young man. And I guess, he recognized, and people around him recognized, that he had a tremendous ability. I don't think there's any doubt, if we're talking about facts again, if you view facts as records that have been put down, great numbers of people in the mountaineering field spoke about his ability. He really was a premier climber. And so the challenge was, when Everest was surveyed in the latter part of the 19th century, no Europeans had been to it until Mallory went on the first expedition in 1921. And they were the first Europeans to view the mountain. They surveyed it more specifically, tried to look for ways to get to the top. But it was an era in which, to be English was to want to be first. So Scott's doomed journey to the South Pole, the farthest reaches of the earth where the British Empire extended, and nothing should be left unconquered.
What about the fame part? Was this an ego thing?
Yeah, I think so, but that's awfully hard to read.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's an ego thing, but I think Mallory was a very self-contained person, a person who felt uncomfortable on the stage. He made a trip to the United States to raise money for the last expedition. He was in the United States in 1923 and was speaking sometimes before thousands of people about the previous two expeditions, and that wasn't something he felt very comfortable with. He didn't like to blow his own horn. He was much more comfortable, as I think most climbers are, though in these days, more comfortable with a small group of people and doing what he could do best. Though in these days, with all of the guided tours to Everest, we have a different kind of animal.
Yeah, it's unbelievable, I suppose, how that's changed. Was he in any way a religious man, or at least did he have some personal metaphysical code?
Well, I think his spirituality was to be found in his communion with the mountains. I mean, I think he felt most at peace with himself and most in touch with what mattered to him when he was climbing. It was an extension of that physical expression.
Have you been to Mount Everest?
No, I haven't.
How do you try to tap into that feeling then in the text of your fiction?
You do a lot of reading. Mm-hmm. You read a lot about mountains and about the history of climbing. I have been to Snowdonia, to where he climbed and when he was young. I have been on Snowdon, and I've done some rock climbing in a minimal kind of way. So I have some basic appreciation of that kind of
But then where
experience.
do you go with it? What is it that happens in your brain cells to try and make that real and vivid?
But you're asking that general question of any writer, and you're a writer yourself. I mean, how things get transposed in the imagination. I was surprised how the story unfolded. I mean, I went into it knowing I was going to write a novel about this. I wanted very much to do it, but I didn't know where it was going to go, and characters appear, and situations appear, and they lead the way.
Okay. Who is your narrator in the novel, and how does his life intersect with Mallory's?
Well, there is a narrator who is in search of the Mallory story, and I guess in part that's autobiographical, but certainly not totally. And the narrator is a kind of archivist who is gathering material and reads different stories, different versions of Mallory's life.
He's contemporary too.
He's contemporary. He's from the 1990s.
Right.
And in his search, he meets a few other characters who knew Mallory or who knew the circle around Mallory, and they tell their stories. So he's got his own take on all of this, which includes diaries and films and journals and newspaper clippings and so on. And he has the stories that are told to him by other people. And he attempts to put this together, but he realizes that you can't put it together. As I was saying earlier, there is no truth that emerges from this, or no story. It's a story about stories.
Mm-hmm. And so the novel has, in some ways, a non-linear structure. You're moving backwards and forwards, and there are different pieces that are pulled together, well, somewhat fragmentary.
Absolutely, but that's like the climbing of a mountain the size of Everest. You don't just start at the bottom and go to the top in one seamless journey. I mean, you're constantly taking supplies up, coming back down, looking for new routes, sometimes false ones, sometimes ones that bear up, and so on. So I think the narrative, in a sense, reflects that.
The form of your novel following the subject that you're writing about.
Yeah.
What does your narrator discover?
Well, he discovers, as I said, that he can't find out the truth about Maori, but he finds out what he thinks are very interesting truths, small t truths that come from the mouths of different characters. In the book, rather than disappear on Everest, Mallory is found alive, saying that he's killed his younger climbing companion, whose name was Andrew Irvin, and he lapses into silence, and the climbing brotherhood closes in around him, because he is such a significant figure, such a symbolic figure, that they don't feel he should be allowed to tell this tale. It would be damaging to all that is England. So they secrete him away, and they take him back to Britain and put him away in North Wales in an old farmhouse where he was when he was a youth. He lives for another 22 years. Unknown to the climbing brotherhood who's looking over him or looking after him, he keeps a journal. A man that the narrator meets, who is 104 years old in the 1990s, is the person who takes care of him, and he tells his story about Mallory.
The whole book, and much what you've been saying here, reflects upon this idea of the dependability of history, which I want to take you back to for a minute. We grow up with a certain mythology in school that history is delivered in a text, and this is the way things actually happened, and most of us after a while figure out it just ain't that way. Some other things are going. Why do you think that's such an important issue, both for you as a fiction writer or for anyone who's concerned with the past of their country?
Well, because I think history is really about what's left out rather than what's put in.
Can you give me an example?
Well, yeah. I mean, how about the incarceration of 20,000 Japanese Canadians in World War II in this country? I grew up in the 1950s and 1960s, and there was nothing in my school textbooks, nothing until I became a graduate student in the 1970s, and really until Joy Kagawa wrote her novel in 1981, Obasan, that in any way pointed to that being a rather significant, to say the least, rather significant event in Canadian history. Generation or two of Canadian children grew up not knowing about this, and it was essentially, part of the racist code in this country. So, I mean, that's just an example of the kinds of things that get eliminated.
And there again, it was fiction that actually began to open up the
doors
to look at the real story and the real history.
Yeah.
Mallory did have a Canadian connection, didn't he?
Well, he did have I think it was an uncle who lived in Toronto, and he did come to Toronto.
Found it too cold.
Yeah, found Montreal too cold, which as I indicate in the book, is a bit puzzling.
Yeah, for a man who's going to go up Everest.
That's right.
And he didn't treat his Sherpa guides all that well.
Well, none of them did. I think that they viewed the Sherpas as children. This was part of the colonizing experience. I mean, they were there to colonize Everest, and there happened to be people there that they needed, as in so many colonial situations, needed to help them do what they wanted to do. The Sherpas were supreme climbers. They also worshipped the mountain. The mountain to them was called Shomalungma, which means Mother Goddess of the Earth. They felt, as did the monks in a monastery about 12 miles from the base of Everest in Tibet, that the demons of the mountain, the gods of the mountain, would not permit the mountain to be climbed, and they were right. But they treated them well in the sense of, they didn't abuse them physically, but they certainly didn't think much of their mental powers.
We're going to come down from Mount Everest, and we're going to talk about Margaret Laurence in a few minutes. We're going to take a break, and then we'll be back with Andy Wainwright right after this.
This series is brought to you as a public service by Mount St. Vincent University.
And we're back. My guest is Andy Wainwright today, and we're going to talk about a book of his, which is a collection of letters that Margaret Laurence wrote to Canadian writers. Andy selected and edited these letters, and so we're going to talk about Margaret Laurence. The title of this book is A Very Large Soul. Where does that come from?
It comes from a couple of writers who are in the book. Silver Donald Cameron, who is, as you know, a Nova Scotia writer, and George Bowring, poet and novelist from British Columbia. Both of whom referred to her as a large soul. I think Bowring was the one who said that there were certain writers in the country who represented the head, the intellect, and others who represented the heart, but Laurence to him represented the soul, and it seemed to me an appropriate title given her relationship with so many writers and the fact that she was viewed during the last 10 or 15 years of her life in particular as the matriarch of Canadian literature.
And it's an amazing collection of letters to many other writers. I don't know anybody in Canada today personally who's writing letters of that length and, you know, of the kind of depth that goes into them. Was she completely unique for her time, or have we already changed that much in recent times?
Well, of course, and this was in pre-email days. She was typing all of these. She was a communicator, and she liked to hear from people. She lived a life alone. I don't want to say that she was lonely, but she was alone during much of her creative career after her children had grown when she came back to Canada. And this was her way of keeping in touch with people around the country. She was also very, very dedicated to the growth and health of the creative process in Canada in terms of writing, and she wanted to encourage younger writers. And so she wrote to them.
Yeah, that's what I noticed, this great concern for other writers, and not even just young writers, but older writers, like she's writing to Ernest Buckler, and others like that. Isn't this a little bit like eavesdropping, though, when you put together a book where I sit down and I read letters from Margaret Laurence to Silver Donald Cameron or to Ernest Buckler?
Well, this is a book in which the editing rationale had to do with the creative process. And all of the letters, the way I edited these letters, all of the letters are about Laurence's writing, about what she's doing and feeling about her own writing, and her commentary upon the writing of others, as well as upon Canadian culture in some specific and more general ways. So if it's eavesdropping on issues that I think are of natural concern to us all. I mean, she was a very important writer. She continues to be. I mean, she published in a 10-year span 5 of the most significant books, and certainly as a collection, the Manawaca series is one of the most significant groups of books to have been published in this country. So it's not like eavesdropping on you know, her personal life, which would have been another matter altogether, and indeed has been eavesdropped upon, as we all know.
Yes, mentioning there is another biography out there of Margaret Laurence that I've looked at, and it seems like the portrait that appears from her letters is radically different from the biography that was written and published and quite popular. How could that be? How could there be like 2 different takes on this person?
Well, because I think James King in his biography of Laurence goes after a lot of her personal life and the details of her personal life, her love life, and her relationships with men, her drinking, you know, and so on. That didn't concern me in this book. It's not what I felt was of significance.
Mm-hmm. Who else was she writing to?
Besides the people that you mentioned?
Yes.
Well, she wrote to older writers to tell them initially how much she appreciated their presence and how they had served as role models for her as writers. And then subsequently a correspondence bloomed between herself and Gabrielle Waugh, for example, and Buckler and Hugh McLennan. And she also wrote to the younger writers who approached her first most of the time, where they would send her something.
Margaret Atwood, even somewhat younger.
Well, Atwood she met at a Governor General's award ceremony in the late 1960s, They both had reputations, although Atwood wasn't quite as established, and became friends.
From the ratings, I see that she very much embraced this writing community of Canada. What was her vision of the Canadian Writing Society?
Well, she called it her tribe, and by that she didn't mean that she possessed it. I mean, she was a member of that tribe, and I think she viewed writers as joined in a community of expression, creative expression, cultural expression. She was a strong Canadian nationalist, and she felt, I think, that if writers didn't keep in touch and let one another know their thoughts and their feelings about Canadian culture, and about how and why they were expressing themselves in this country as they were, then you know, the individual books were drops in the bucket and could easily be sucked into, as so much has been, the American cultural sphere.
Toward the end of her life especially, she was very much an outspoken activist. What were some of the social, political issues that she was most concerned about?
Well, I think Laurence became a feminist later in her life. She was very, very concerned with women's issues, with environmental issues, and in particular with the question of the proliferation of nuclear weapons. She wrote letters. It wasn't just a matter of lending her name to such things. She was an active person in advocacy groups on these issues.
That generosity that you speak of seems to be something that grew with her along with her career. Is that the way it happened, or did she start out a very generous person, a very large soul?
No, I think she grew into it, and I think she would say that in finding her voice, her Canadian voice, the Manawaka voice, that the characters and the situations that she wrote about, but that also wrote her, contributed to this opening up of herself as a figure of communication, and someone who was a voice who not only wanted to speak and be heard, but who wanted to be spoken to.
Who were the Canadian writers that she was closest to?
She was closest to people, it's interesting that she didn't see very much. Like Hubert Evans on the West Coast, for example, Budge Wilson here on the East Coast, and people like Gabrielle Roy that she met once, I think, and in 12 years of correspondence.
Be back after this.
If you'd like more information about this program or any of the courses we offer at a distance, call us or visit our website. We welcome your comments.
Hi again, my guest today is Andy Wainwright. We're right here at the tail end of the show. Andy, we're talking about Margaret Laurence, and what kind of things about her spirituality are revealed in the letters to other writers in Canada?
Well, Laurence called herself a spiritual person rather than a religious person. She was raised in the United Church, and she had a rather Calvinist grandfather about whom she wrote in A Bird in the House, and I think that turned her away from the tenets and the restrictions of organized religion. But the figures in her last novel, The Diviners, Morag and Piper Gunn, who is the real and symbolic figure of the Scots side, and Jules Tonnerre, and in particular Christy Logan. They're all spiritual people in their way, and by spirituality, I think Laurence meant a strong connection to one's roots, a strong connection to one's lived experience that transforms one and takes you beyond the bonds and the boundaries of that lived experience in ways that allow you to share it with others through storytelling. The Diviners is all about storytelling, and that, of course, is what Margaret Laurence did herself.
Okay, Andy, thanks for being here today, talking about Margaret Laurence and talking about your novel as well.
Thank you.
And I thank you for watching Off the Page. I'll see you again next time.